Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us this evening. It's wonderful to have you. My name is Eric McBay. I am the Director of Special Projects for the NFU Ontario. I'm also a farmer, part of a CSA farm called Root Radical, just east of Kingston, Ontario. So this is a joint workshop this evening between the NFU Ontario and the Ontario Farmland Trust. We're grateful for the support of the Greenbelt Foundation in funding this workshop. This is part of a workshop series and some of the general land linking work that we're doing. So I will invite you to fill out a questionnaire that we'll paste into the chat. And to come to some of our upcoming workshops. So our next workshop in this mini-series is going to be happening next Thursday evening, November the 18th at 7 p.m. It's going to be about farm financing. So I live on the traditional territory of the Anishinaabe and the Haudenosaunee. I invite you to introduce yourself in the chat, to mention the Indigenous territories of the place where you live, if you know that, and also to indicate if you're a land seeker, a landholder, something else, a farmer in general. And I wanted to let you know that the event is being recorded for use on YouTube. If you have any technical issues during the presentation, you can send a direct message to me in the chat, and I'll see if I can help you out. We'll be going tonight until somewhere between 8:30 and 9 o'clock, depending on how active the discussion is. We will keep questions for the end. We have 3 farmer panelists and 1 other farmland expert speaking. So if you have questions as we go, please do put them in the chat and I'll make a note of them, or just save them till the end and I'll call on you and you can unmute and ask your question by video if you like. All right, so I'll mention briefly the presenters we have. I'll read their particular bios just before they speak. Tonight we have Catherine Gold from the Ontario Farmland Trust. We have Rav Singh from Shades of Meaty. We have Tom Robson from Meat and Potatoes Farm. And we have Angie Koch from Fertile Ground CSA. So I'm going to start by inviting Catherine Gold, who's the Executive Director of the Ontario Farmland Trust, to make a brief presentation for us about the value of farmland with all kinds of soil. So I'll just set up your spotlight here and set up your slides in just a moment, and then you'll be able to get started.
Thanks so much, Eric. And thank you for having me. It's been great working with the NFUO on this project around succession planning. I'm excited to do a quick overview on some of the other stuff that we're working on, which is the value of soils of all classes in Ontario. And then we really look forward to getting to our feature presentations. Perfect. Thanks, Eric, for sharing that. Okay, so we can actually just go right into the next slide, if you don't mind. The Ontario Farmland Trust is the only registered charity in Ontario with a province-wide mission to protect Ontario farmlands, including agricultural, natural, and cultural features. And we've been around since 2004. Next slide. We have a few main activities. One of them is protecting farmland on the ground. Next slide. Perfect. That's great. Thank you. So we protect farmland with legal agreements called farmland easement agreements. And those are agreements that are registered on the title of the property and can never be undone. We only work with willing farmers who want to work with us, but once the agreements are registered, they can't be removed and all future owners must abide by them. We also accept donations of farmland. We work with the government on policy development, and we do outreach and education, including our annual Farmland Forum event, which this year takes place on March the 24th, and it will be virtual again. So we hope many of you can join us there. Next slide. The reason that we do what we do is because we're losing a lot of agricultural land and quickly in Ontario. The last census of agriculture showed that about 175 acres of land are lost every day in Ontario to non-agricultural uses like subdivisions, aggregate, landfills, and the like. Next slide. We have been able to protect 17 properties so far, and by the end of the year, we will have 20 protected in total. We are working on many more, and we're trying to get all the way across the province. Next slide. Currently, most protections for farmland that are outlined in provincial land use policies are actually focused on protecting prime agricultural land. Prime agricultural lands are generally made up of soils that have been designated as class 1 to 3 by the Canada Land Inventory. The CLI is a wide-scale soil survey that was done in the 60s, 70s, and 80s, and basically it ranks soil into 7 classes based on how capable that soil would be at producing traditional row crops like corn, soybean, and wheat. Outside of specific provincial land use plans like the Greenbelt Plan, only prime agricultural land, which is class 1 through 3, receives those protections, which are not strong enough to prevent farmland loss in areas where development pressures are high. Next slide. As you all know, we have a finite amount of agricultural land available to us in Ontario, and this is a map of the various soil classes. You can see that they are kind of interspersed amongst each other. So if we only protect classes 1 through 3, then the land base gets really fragmented and weakened, and then development pressures become even higher. Next slide. The interesting thing is that the CLI land classes don't actually account for all of the factors that affect productivity of an agricultural soil. And soils that don't fall into prime agricultural can actually be very productive. We're able to work around limitations that a soil might have by using different management techniques. For instance, changing the nutrient levels or the soil organic matter levels to make soils more productive. Ontario's agricultural sector is very diverse, producing over 200 different commodities on a commercial scale. And many of those crops require different and unique growing conditions, and they're able to thrive on farmland that fall outside of class 1 through 3. Ontario is home to a number of microclimates that provide different growing conditions, and we can't replicate those anywhere else. So even soils of lower classes in those areas are very unique and extremely valuable. The CLI was created with a focus on typical row crops, and it's not really an accurate representation of how suitable the land would be for crops that fall outside of that realm. And so we're really pushing to have all farmland protected to make sure that there is land available to host all different types of agriculture. Next slide. So what is possible on farmlands that are not considered prime agricultural land? Some tender fruit crops like grapes, peaches, and others do well on really sandy soil that drains quickly, and those soils could be considered poor for producing row crops like corn or soy. Grapes can grow on class 6 land, so a thriving wine industry can be built on lands that are not considered prime agriculture, and so if we were to pave over those and not protect them, we're losing a lot of our valuable land in the province. There are also a number of crops that are not picky and can do well on a variety of soils, like onions, hay, pasture land, just to name a few. Agriculture is always evolving in Ontario, and so we shouldn't exclude any possibilities, because land that's not good, not considered good for agriculture right now may actually be well suited to different types of agriculture in the future. Next slide. There is a critical mass of farmland that's needed to maintain the viability of any agricultural system, because as you know, without farmland, we can't farm. And farmlands of lower classes really add to that critical mass. Farmland also produces a wide range of ecosystem services, like filtering and storing water, sequestering carbon, providing habitat for wildlife. Some species at risk, like the bobolink, which I saw Eric just mention, rely on pastures and hay fields, as their native grassland habitat is scarce due to human activity. Permanent pasture lands used by species such as the bobolink are well suited to lower classes of farmland. Next slide. Ontario's farmland is a non-renewable resource, and every time we lose farmland, that impacts future generations greatly. Even though there are some protections in place in provincial policy, we continue to lose farmland. So it is clear that we need stronger, more widespread protection for all of Ontario's farmland. The best way to ensure the strength of the sector is to provide our diverse array, to protect our diverse array of agricultural soils to ensure that we always have soil available to produce different types of crops and help protect the viability of the sector in the long term. So this is the last slide. That's the end of the soils part of this. And Eric, I'll pass it back over to you to introduce our first panelist.
Wonderful, thank you very much. And if you are just joining us, please introduce yourself in the chat. If you know the Indigenous territory that you're living on, please mention that as well. My name is Eric McBay. I'm the Director of Special Projects for the NFU Ontario. So now we enter kind of our main theme of the evening, which is about land linking, land partnerships, and collaboration. So we have 3 farmer panelists tonight who are going to be speaking about their farms and their land situation. So I'm going to invite first Rav Singh from Shade of Miti. Miti Acres is an organic, non-certified farm that focuses on building and using healthy soil to combat climate change. Miti Acres will help strengthen rural-urban food links and will focus on growing crops for communities that are excluded and not recognized in white-lid food spaces, such as farmers, markets, grocery stores, etc. And the website is shadeofmiti.ca. Rav, thank you so much for joining us tonight.
Hi, everyone. Thanks for having me and thanks for joining. All right, hopefully you can all see my screen now. So welcome. My name is Rav. I use she, her pronouns. I'm in Mississauga, which is Treaty 13 land and the traditional territories of the Wendat, Anishinaabe, Haudenosaunee, and Mississaugas of the Credit. I run Shade of Miti, which is a food and climate justice organization in the region of Peel, which includes Mississauga, Brampton, and Caledon, if you're not familiar with the area. So at Shade of Miti, there's 3 things that we focus on. There we go. There's 3 things that we focus on: education, advocacy, and the thing that I'm going to be focusing on today is growing. So I have a farm. I'm renting some land at a farm in Caledon where I specialize, kind of like Eric alluded to, in growing organic vegetables. The things that I specialize more in include bitter melon, okra, eggplant, and hot peppers, although I do grow a little bit of everything, which is really exciting. So the farm that I'm on, there's a lot going on the property, which is always really exciting. The farm itself is owned by a family who also lives on the property. And they've been farming the land for many decades, and they started farming organically sometime in the 1970s. And they haven't farmed the land since 2015, 2016. But they do have a small garden still on the property where they grow just for personal consumption. And they also have some chickens, which is always nice to go visit them. And they also have a composting setup, which is really cool because all the different types of farmers and growers who I will explain in a little bit who are on the property are welcome to use the compost, contribute to it, and also take from it. So the family that lives on the property, they have a lot of different types of growers that they're working with, and each one is really unique, and there's a different type of kind of like partnership collaboration style that they have set up with each person. So to give you an idea of who's on the farm, there's one farmer or one gardener who's using some space on the property to just grow some vegetables for himself and his family. So he has just, I think it's 10 by 10 square foot of space for personal consumption. There's a beekeeper on the site who has a bunch of different hives across the property, and he's also based in Mississauga. So he has his beehives up in Caledon, but most of his market is in Mississauga. There's another individual who has his own farm, but he rents an additional 5 acres on this property to grow some grain. And then there's me. This was my first year on this property, and I was growing on about 1/4 of an acre, although I will be expanding next year. And it was really interesting because the field that I am on was shared with another farmer who runs his own catering business in Brampton and grows primarily for that business. So it was really interesting because we informally and without knowing it, ended up creating kind of like a co-op, farming co-op system between the two of us, which was really nice because we were able to share labor. We helped each other out at markets, and for some of the big cost items like getting compost and renting big equipment, we were able to share the cost and labor of that, which was really cool. And if any of you are looking for land or new to farming, I definitely, if you have an opportunity to learn more about food co-ops or farm co-ops and participate in one, I definitely encourage you to do that. So I had a lot of challenges. I'm really happy where I am, but I did have a lot of challenges finding this piece of land because I was in Mississauga and I wasn't really well connected in the farming world. And it took me a very, very long time to find the piece of land that I did find. And basically how I got it was I just started literally telling everyone online and anyone I met in person who would listen to me that I was looking for some land. And through that, the beekeeper who is on this property, he heard that I was looking for land, and I kind of knew him as an acquaintance from some farmers markets in Mississauga. So he connected me to this land, and I'm very, very lucky to be where I am. So when I was looking for some places and some land to be on, these were some of the things that I was looking for. It was really important for me that I was working with a landowner or a farmer who had values that were similar to mine. Obviously, I wanted something that would work within my budget. I was also open to looking at work exchanges. So the piece of property that I'm on now is really nice because for the first few months, he wasn't charging me anything in terms of monetary value for the land, but I was helping him around the farm, looking after his chickens. There were some big construction pieces that were happening that I was helping with. So it was kind of more of a work exchange for me being on the land. And then when I was able to, we switched over to more of a monetary agreement. Another thing that was really important to me was making sure our communication styles were aligned. I really don't particularly like talking to people when I'm farming. So it's important for me that I could just come, show up, do my thing. I didn't have to check in every single day and have a huge conversation with people. I could just come do my thing and then leave. Because I'm in Mississauga, it's really important for me to stay in the city and work on food justice in the city. So I needed to make sure it was really close to my home and to the markets in Mississauga that I was wanting to be part of. Expectations, you always want to just have what your expectations are as a renter, and what your expectations of your land, whoever you're working with are. You want to make sure that's really nice and clear. Infrastructure, it's just nice to have a good sense of, if you were to be on a certain farm, what types of infrastructure is available for you to use. Space for expansion was, this was a really key thing for me to consider because I knew I wanted to start small, but I also knew that over the years I wanted to grow. And I was really, at the place that I am right now, there is space for me to grow, which is always really nice. And then another thing that I looked at was care for the land. So it was important for me to know just how the land was treated before I was there, and what the other farmers who had been there before me, how they were taking care of the land. So my top tips, if you're getting into a new partnership or new collaboration, is just to get to know the landowner or the farmer, whoever you're going to be working with. This was when I got connected to where I am now. It was really nice because we were connected through a mutual acquaintance. So I knew that, you know, if he was friends with the beekeeper who I knew, he was probably a cool guy that I wouldn't mind working with. But if you don't know that or have a reference through a friend or an acquaintance, it's definitely important to have some conversations with them, or you can even ask them for references of other farmers who have worked with them. Now that I've been there for a year and I know that I like it, I'm starting to think long term. So a really big conversation that I had with the landowner, and that I encourage you to have if you're thinking about a partnership or collaboration for the long term, depending, especially if you're in the green belt or in certain parts of Ontario, is just finding out what the future plans are for the land. So the landowner, he's getting older. And so it's important for me to meet his daughter and have conversations with her because, I mean, hopefully not anytime soon, but at some point she will be taking over the farm and the land. So I just wanted to make sure that we also had a good relationship between the two of us. Also, where the farm is located, it's kind of on the border of Brampton and Caledon. So if you're familiar with the area, there's a lot of development, not creeping up, it's like running towards where the farm is. And where the farm is, it's about 2 kilometers away from where Highway 413 would be. So I know the development is coming, and it's just important for me to have that conversation with the landowner to see what their plans are for the future, if they were gonna, you know, thinking of selling anytime soon or anything like that, because that would impact, you know, what my plans were. So the last thing I wanted to talk about was my soil, to tie it back to what Catherine was talking about. So soil, I think, is really important to consider whether you're renting long-term or short-term, because soil is definitely a key to your success as a farmer, and it's also a key to our climate crisis. So there are 2 challenges that I faced with my soil at the farm. One of them you'll see in the video here. It's very, very clay heavy soil. So I was always dealing with my soil being at 2 extremes. It was either very, very slick and muddy and waterlogged, or it looked like this, very cracked and hard and just very, very dry. So some things that helped me with my soil at the farm, because I was a short-term renter, if you're a short-term renter, you can't implement every idea that you have because you are limited in what you're able to do. So these are some of the things that helped me. So my first thing that I did was I found out from the landowner how the soil had been treated in the past. I got tips from the previous farmers who had been there on what worked for them, what didn't, what their challenges were. I never left my soil bare, so all of my beds were covered with straw, and that really helped. I did have to feed my soil a little bit with organic compost and some manure, although the soil, it was very productive and really, really healthy to begin with. I did add a little bit just to support it. Using the right tools took me a very, very long time to find out and caused me a lot of sore muscles. But once I found the tools that worked well with the soil I had, it definitely helped a lot. And then also cover cropping and using tarps and landscape fabric were really good techniques for me that worked. The second challenge I had with my soil was climate change and just how it was impacting my soil. So 3 ways that it impacted my soil was it changed the irrigation needs and affected the soil moisture, which I really had to pay attention to a lot. And almost daily, I had to adapt my irrigation and watering techniques to meet what the soil needed. It obviously affected my crop production, and more importantly, it affected the weed productivity. And then the third thing it affected my farm was the habitats. So the habitat of good insects that you want, pollinators, snakes, birds, all that stuff, but also the habitat of pests and things that I wasn't super eager to see at my farm. But the most important thing, I think, when you're thinking about climate change and soil is to remember that whether you're farming or gardening or doing any type of food growing project, is that climate change will most importantly impact you. It'll impact your physical health, your well-being, and your mental health too. And these are all really important things to think about and consider when you're, going into your farm. So with those challenges, I know there's a lot of different things that you like, tests and soil tests and all these things that you can do. I personally didn't want to invest in them to see how healthy and what I could do with my soil, because I wasn't sure if I was going to be there longer than a year. I also am a new farmer, so I didn't have like a lot of resources available to me. So the two things that I did look for that required minimal financial input and were super, super simple was just looking at the biodiversity and productivity of the space as an indicator of how my farm was performing overall, and also how my soil was performing. I think that's the end of my presentation. Thanks so much for listening. If you do have any questions, you can put them in the chat and we'll get to them at the end of all the speakers. But I'll pass it back to Eric.
Wonderful. Thanks so much for telling us about your important work and your beautiful farm. I look forward to digging in even more during the question period. So next, we are going to be joined by Tom Robson from Meat and Potatoes Farm. Meat and Potatoes Farm produces calorie-dense vegetables, potatoes and friends, with as much human power, muscle, and heart, read meat, as we can muster. Learn more at meatandpotatoes.farm. Hi, Tom. How are you doing there? Is your video working properly?
Yeah, we're fully operational here.
Amazing. Glad to hear it.
Is my sound coming through okay?
Yes, it's all good. I'll pass it over to you, and just let me know when you want me to start sharing your slides.
Yeah, very good. I'll take a minute or two with preamble, and then we'll throw some slides in. Thank you, Eric and Sunil, for hosting. Thank you, other panelists. It's really great to meet you and see you. And thanks to everyone who's tuning in to join in. So I'm completely humbled to be joining you all because Meat and Potatoes Farm is really new. We're incubating this idea this year. And I'll share a little bit about the farm and then get into some of the nuts and bolts about our land use agreement and the land sharing that we have with our landowner. So this farm and project really found me. I wasn't really looking to necessarily be doing this. I have a full-time job off the farm, but COVID was a great excuse and a great opportunity to try some things that have been orbiting around, and this land that we're on found me as well through our local community, and I'll speak a little bit more about that later. So I work full-time off farm in the charitable sector, also in farm and garden related work. And in starting this project, at least at this stage, it's certainly, we wanted to do something that would be complementary to that. So not necessarily, we're investing our time on evenings and weekends on this. So it's something that we wanted to keep small and simple and really manageable and successful in terms of, at least initially, in the management of the farm. So I think that it's fair to say that what we're doing is incubating in its purest sense of the form. So we're really just trying some things and seeing what is working and seeing what happens and sort of seeing what hatches and where we can go with it from there. So this was year one. This was season one of Meat and Potatoes Farm, and the inspiration behind it is actually, related to the climate crisis that we're in, and that the question for us is, how could we produce as many calories as possible with as much human muscle as possible? That was sort of the challenge that we put out for ourselves. when we started this project. So consequently, for this year, we've kept things really, really simple. We have a 1/4 acre, and we're growing bulk potatoes and bulk squash. So we've started choosing crops that tend to have a high caloric density per space, per acre, per square foot, and we're selling primarily to other CSAs in the area. So as some of you may know, a lot of CSA farmers are really trying to hone and intensify their production, and often those are the crops that get left outside of the crop mix. So we're trying to offer locally grown, homegrown, hand-tended potatoes and squash to some other growers who hold those same values. So we sell directly to a lot of them, and then they incorporate that into their CSAs or on-farm markets. And then we have a couple other customers in the area too. We have a couple of restaurants and a couple of small grocers who buy from us. And we also experimented with like a harvest box around the Thanksgiving season, where we would provide some specialty potatoes and a whole variety of different squash. And we contacted all of our friends and neighbors and networked that way. And that seemed to work really well too. So that's how we're selling our produce. But yeah, we're in year 1. It's a 1/4 acre, and we're located in the Ottawa area. So I guess for now, let's go to slide 1 and just have a closer look of where we're located. All right, so this map is of the Ottawa area. You can see the Ottawa River is sort of, cutting into the slide there. And the farm's located on unceded Algonquin territory. And if you look to the far top right, there's a little green highlight spot. That's right downtown Ottawa. So that's where the Parliament buildings are. And then if you follow your eye across the map to the west, towards the left side of the map, you'll see a little green highlighted space there. That's the village of Carp, Ontario. So Carp is a bedroom community, but also has a long agricultural history and has a lot of farming roots there. And it's sort of right on the suburban edge of the city of Ottawa. So like I said, this spot in this project found me insofar as there's a vineyard that opened in Carp about 10 years ago, and they've been making improvements year over year. And through some local connections, we learned that they have lots of fallow land, and they'd love to see other producers doing some unique projects on their property. So it was sort of through that. It was really just through community networking that we found the spot. It's a great location. It's right on the edge of a small village that has, a library and a farmer's market and it's sort of a day tripping location for a lot of people in the Ottawa region. There's a creamery, there's the vineyard, there's a really large farmer's market on Saturdays. So there's a lot of people that come out to this spot as a destination for a day trip or a half day trip. Let's go to the next slide. So this is what I've done here is I've just sort of drawn a box around the property or around the farm. So like I said, I'm renting land from Kin Vineyards, and Kin Vineyards, like I said, they established a vineyard about 5 to 10 years ago. They're on a 50-acre property in the Carp Valley, which is home to the Carp River. It's largely Class 2 and Class 3 agricultural land. There's a lot of clay in this basin, and it's largely a corn and soy, like corn and soy predominate the area. But where this vineyard is, it's a little bit up on the ridge, so it's got some sandier deposits. So it's a little bit of mixture. There's where we have our plot, it's quite a sandy plot with a clay base further underneath. So 50 acres on the vineyard, about 15 of that 50 are in grapes that they're using to make wine. And there's roughly 5 to 10 acres, about 8 to 10 acres of fallow land that has just been in pasture for at least the last 5 years. So that's where we've been able to set up. And I think we could go to the next slide at this point. So we're just kind of zooming in a little bit further here. So the small box with the check mark is the spot that we've been growing on this year. So it's a 1/4 acre plot, and it's right along the one of the main roads that accesses the farm. And you notice I drew another large box just adjacent to that with a big question mark. So kind of similar to what Rob was explaining, one of the things that we wanted to make sure is that we had the theoretical potential to expand if we wanted to. And there's definitely room for us to do that. If we start to outgrow the 1/4 acre that we've been experimenting with this year, we can move across the street and start growing there. And there are actually even more fields where we could expand to. So that was definitely something that we wanted to make sure was possible. We didn't want to have to move to another location if we decided that we wanted to increase our scale and scale up. One of the unforeseen benefits of being at the spot is that the vineyard is also really investing on getting a lot more on-site activities. So they opened a pizza oven this year. They have a tasting room. And again, in this time of COVID, people are looking for places to go. And there's probably on any given day, the parking lot has, 40 to 50 cars, parked out, people having pizza, drinking wine, enjoying the vineyard. So we're just sort of learning that there's a huge opportunity for us to work with the vineyard and their food service and even maybe do some direct sales on farm. But that's sort of, future planning that we're going to see. But all this is to say it's a hub of activity. So it's not a farm that is sort of out in the, it's not an isolated spot. There's a lot of traffic. It's really visible. There's a lot of people visiting, and that's just been an interesting asset of this spot. I think I'll shift a little bit and just speak a little more to the, the relationship with the landowners. So the owners of the vineyard are a couple who are nearing the ends of their career, and they've invested in this vineyard as something that they'd like to transition into. And also, they've also incorporated their family into the business. And they have an amazing winemaker, and they've just been really interesting people to connect with. But all this is to say, when the opportunity came up and the offer was there to come, a few things that they've included in the rental for now, obviously, is the use of the land, but there's access to water. So if you look at that slide where I have the little plot, there's the winery is right next to it. So there's a great water supply, great volume, great pressure to at least do a small plot at this scale. So that was ready to go and ready to tap into. And they also offered an equipment share, which was really helpful. So they have a very small 20 horsepower Kubota tractor, and they have a larger 85 horsepower tractor that they use in the vineyard. So not really suited for what I'm doing, but the smaller tractor has been helpful when we have needed to do some tillage or move things around with pallet forks. So all this is to say they've been very generous in terms of equipment use as well. And the other thing that is really interesting is the vineyard owners are scaling up their business. So they're investing a lot of money and a lot of time in developing the vineyard, parking, wedding venue, pizza oven, all of these things. So even though what we're doing is on, economically on a much smaller scale, they understand that we're investing, money and time into something that we're learning about and growing. So we're sort of on this parallel track. So they're very understanding in terms of us being a startup and what we need and just sort of what the flavor of that is. Something that we've talked about in terms, so right now the use of the land in this year has been free of charge. However, we're gonna work towards a profit share. So if and when our little farm starts to generate more revenue, we'll set out a profit share with them, and we're looking at something in the 7 to 10% range. And we're really happy with that for now, because what it means is that we can really focus on investing in the startup and the growth and kind of reinvesting back into the farm. And if we have seasons where things aren't strong for whatever reason, they will ride those waves with us. So it's sort of a unique relationship that way. So we're not bound to any kind of like static rent that way. The relationship's gone really well. I'm really happy with it. It's been a really good relationship. I think the way I would describe it is that we've just been really good. It's just been a really positive, neighborly type relationship. The landowners have been very helpful, but have also been very, they've given me some space and autonomy. Like they're not really sticking their nose into what we're doing and critiquing what we're doing. They're curious, they're excited, but they're really focused on their own business, and we're really focused on ours, and that's actually worked well. It's sort of we've sort of like respected a bit of autonomy and space that way. I think something that, I may mention this, double back on this a little bit later, but there's some reputational currency, I would call it, that we're exchanging, which is really important. So right now, one of the shortcomings is that we had all the intentions of having a land use agreement in place this year, and we weren't able to do it. And we're committed to doing that for next year. So it does leave both of us vulnerable that way, but there are people, because we're in a small town and where there's a small number of visible business owners, and because of our relationship that we have with the winemaker at the farm, my wife runs a business in this town, and some other things, like we just really trust that our kind of reputation between one another is something that we can trust and serve us at this stage. But definitely that's something that I wouldn't recommend. We should have rightfully had something on paper in an agreement that we can move forward with, and that's our plan for this year. And I'm just trying to think of any challenges that we've had. There really were no challenges. I mean, something that that I think, again, I'll echo something that Rob brought up, is that I mean, we need to be clear about how the needs of the growth of their business, of the vineyard, could impact ours. They're wonderful people. They have a lot of ideas, and something that I glean is that sometimes, they have an idea to develop something here, and then that shifts to doing something there. So I think just being really clear about, okay, if we're going to be doing something here for, the longer term, in 5 to 10 year increments, how can we be sure that the context isn't going to change of what they need in terms of their own land use. So that's something that I'm keeping an eye to. And I think to just to summarize, or if I can provide any insight or advice for anyone who's moving forward with their own relationship with a landowner. Oh, forgive me, I lost track of my slides. There's more. Let's bring another slide in. Let's go to the next one. This is just like an overview of the plot. Squash, potatoes, and I will, so I just wanted to share a little bit more about just about things that I think have worked, or just things that you can think about if you're entering into a land use agreement or a relationship like that. I mean, I think of it just like any other relationship, any other friendship, any other intimate relationship. I mean, the more you can depend on a spirit of selflessness and kindness, I think that's really going to set the foundation for a really healthy relationship. So if you have if you have concerns about that in terms of the landowner, then you may want to, question that relationship. But from what I can tell, the landowners who I'm working with, they've been yes people. They've been very supportive. And in reciprocating that, I've tried my best to be helpful, sharing the harvest with them. I've been providing them with, things that will help, some crops and pumpkins and flowers and things that can contribute and beautify. And this isn't written into the relationship. These are just, acts of kindness and that we're doing to help one another. So I think just remembering that and how you can feed that relationship is really helpful. I think too, if when you're in a land use agreement, or if you're working with a landowner, and if you're sharing things, whether it's equipment, whether it's land, or those things, anticipating what your needs will be as far in advance as you can is really helpful. Because in my example, the needs of the vineyard are going to precede my needs, in our plot. So anytime I knew something was coming, whether it was, tractor use or wanting to, check in about something related to the water system or that, I would always try to have those conversations well in advance of when I know I'm going to need them. And then it just gives some people time to, it gives us time to work those things out. Because I'm trying to avoid getting a situation where I'm springing something on the landowner, and trying to avoid surprising them with needs that may come up. This may not be possible for all of us, but I've sort of caught landowners at what I would call, quote unquote, the grandparenting stage of their lives. So they've had full careers. They're excited about this new vineyard project. They just bought the vineyard a couple of years ago, and they're in that, they sort of have the spirit of grandparent energy, and that's actually really supporting what I'm doing well, because they're just really curious and excited and interested to see what I'm doing. So we may not necessarily have that option or choice of people, but it is something that I found really interesting, is that they're not depending on what I'm doing in a particular way. They're just sort of excited, and they're just seeing as what we're doing is adding value to what they're doing at the vineyard. The only other thing I would, on a practical note, I would say, and this isn't always, probably wasn't possible for us this year because we decided to ramp this up in the winter. So we decided in January, February that we were going to make this happen. And so in hindsight, if you're able to plan ahead and do groundwork and get some things in place, the growing season before, whether it's doing your ground prep or soil sampling or getting some irrigation things in place or any of that, I would just recommend. That's really helpful. It just helps you to be more successful in your first growing season. So we had to
Oh, you're on mute there, Tom, I think.
There, am I back?
You're back.
Okay, thank you. It wouldn't be a Zoom meeting without someone who needs a lot of hand holding. All right, we'll do one more slide, and then I think I'll wrap it up there. This is our son. This is our son, Charlie. And part of what we're doing is also with him in mind. He's 6 years old. So that's part of what's informing the farm for us as well, is a place where he can plug in and do some learning and contribute to something as well. So I'd be remiss if I didn't include that in the whole story. So thanks again, everyone. And yeah, I look forward to where the conversation goes from here and learning more about some of the other growers. I know there was some, forgive me, I know there were some points too around, soil and land. I'm happy to add more about that if this is the right time and climate. But because I've been on the plot for one season, there's just really a lot of observation and learning that I need to do. Like I guess to just provide a brief synopsis, like we're on a really sandy spot, really sandy soil, but it's been productive. We've been really happy with that. We've done some amending with compost and some other amendments, composted chick manure, some fertigation as well. But there's definitely some work that needs to be done on our soil in terms of soil structure and water retention. It's interesting. So it's very sandy and it's highly compacted underneath. So it was, in perennial hay for many years and corn and soy before that. So it's like any spot, it's got its challenges, but overall, it's been a productive farm. We're happy to be working in a sandier spot than some of the clay soils that are in our area. We feel really fortunate about that. Some of the challenges that we have in our plot are the perennial weeds, because it was in a hay crop before us. So we put a lot of sweat into it early on in the season, just really trying to stay on top of any of the perennial weed development as it came. So yeah, I think weed management on a new plot is always like such a huge challenge and conundrum sometimes. But we had a really clean plot otherwise, and that's where the benefit of keeping things, I think, really small and manageable is wise in a startup, because you can you won't be, you're less likely to be overwhelmed with that challenge. Climate and weather. It's again, because it's our first season, it's really hard to tell what the longer arc of these changes are. I will say that this, like a lot of you experienced, we had a really early spring melt this year. So there was a lot of really intense flooding that just lasted for a few days. So we're interested to see if that's a trend that's going to continue, and if that contributes to any flooding or erosion problems moving forward. The other thing that we had such a hot August this year that our maturation dates were earlier than we were expecting for our crops, and it was fine. We adapted to that, but really what it means now is it impacts some of the longer term storability of our potatoes and squash, because everything came out of the ground and everything came out of the field earlier than we were anticipating. But it's certainly something that we've been able to manage, but something that we'll pay attention to moving forward. I guess the last challenge in terms of climate and weather that we're having at our site, and I wouldn't necessarily say it's directly related to climate change, but it's related to a lot of the loss of woodlots and tree lines and hedgerows. So the area that we're in, like I said, is largely corn and soy, and so a lot of the woodlots and hedgerows and trees have been brought down to expand fields and open fields. And the wind that's generated in our area and in our valley is wicked. It can be really challenging. And it's something that we've had to adapt to. Like, we're in a valley that has a northwest orientation, so the prevailing winds just come racing down the valley. And without some of those intermittent breaks throughout the whole region, it's something that we've noticed. It's just really, really windy some days, and we've had to adapt to that. It just like had to triple the number of sandbags on the farm that I anticipated we would need. So these are some of the small kind of like microclimate nuances that I think are they're complex, but we're all kind of working to adapt to them as we go. So I don't have much more to add. Thanks again, everyone. And I look forward to any questions or conversations. And back to you, Eric.
Thank you so much, Tom. That was great. So much valuable information there. Yes, and people, please do put some questions in the chat. So now we're gonna move on to our very final presenter before we get into the Q&A. So Angie Koch from Fertile Ground CSA. Fertile Ground is a small organic farm just west of Waterloo. We produce vegetables and eggs for our 350-member vegetable CSA, as well as a few local restaurants, retail shops, and food bank organizations. The website is fertilegroundcsa.com. Thank you so much, Angie, for joining us tonight.
Thanks so much for having me.
Oh, I think you're back on mute again. There we go.
There we go. The screen share was just locked for a moment, so here we are. And okay, I think we're all set up here. So Fertile Ground is the name of my farm. And we're located on the treaty lands and territory of the Mississaugas of the Credit, just west of the Haldeman Tract, which is the 6 kilometers on either side of the Grand River that runs north-south through Kitchener-Waterloo. So I'm just about 20 minutes from uptown Waterloo, which is a fairly dense urban core. This is the parcel of land that I'm on. It's a 100-acre farm. It's the purple rectangle just above the words Carmel Koch Road. This is a few years old. The gardens are about twice as big as they were in this photo, but everything is sort of in the same general areas. So you can see it's mixed use. There's the gardens, we've got hay fields, there's a meadow section, and then there's a fair bit of woodlot and wetland. The wetland is all within the purple lines. We've got about 10 acres now in market garden, about 40 acres in hay, 10 acres or so in meadow habitat, and the balance is in, which is about 40 acres again, is in wetland. So here's a view of the gardens currently. So I'll take you just through a few photos so you can picture the place where we are here, while I talk a little bit about how I landed at this place. So in 2007, I did an internship through the CRAFT program at Everdale Farm, just outside of Erin, Orangeville area, and came out of that deciding that I wanted to start up a farm business. So so that left me in about September or October of that year, quitting my job and racing to look for farmland that I could have prepped before the end of October. And I was pretty attached to being in the Waterloo area because that's where family and friends and community are. And the thought of starting up a business was terrifying enough to imagine doing it separate from my community. And being, I didn't want the isolation of moving to a place where I could afford to buy land, which actually I couldn't afford to do anywhere, but where I would maybe eventually have been able to afford to buy land if things went well. So I called the only person I knew who had access to farmland in the Waterloo region, and he met with me and was subleasing this property here where I am. So that's the spoiler alert. One phone call led me to the person who hooked me up with this land, which wasn't remotely what I was expecting. I thought I'd have friends of friends and children and nephews and uncles and whatnot to go through before I landed on a piece of property. So we came out to this land together, and he said, well, okay, you say you want 2 acres. So if you can pace out for me what 2 acres look like, I will sublease this land to you. So I did my best, and he said, well, it's about 1.5 acres. So it's not like you think it's only 200 square feet. So I think you have some idea what you're in for. Let's do it. So that was sort of year one, and the initial agreement was pretty, I think I was so worried about so many things in business startup, and I had no idea whether I would do this for a year or 50 years. And so my concern about long-term tenure was not the highest on my list of priorities. I was not going to be living on this plot of land. There's a house there rented by someone else. And so I was going to keep my apartment in Kitchener and commute the 20 minutes to the farm every day. Took some pressure off it needing to have sort of stability in terms of just a place to live. And so, and they didn't even charge me any rent for the first 2 seasons, which was incredible. But then things started to change, and that family was no longer going to maintain the lease at this property. So I had to transition my lease to the actual landowners. And fortunately, the couple that owned the land, the Schneider's family of Schneider's Meatpacking, once upon a time, though that was sold as a family business quite a long time ago. But what they did when they sold that family business is they bought a whole lot of land in this area. And so this is one of the farms and one of the few farms that no family members live on. So it's investment land. And what was really fortunate for me is that the landowner couple are conservationists. They believe in organic agriculture. They were so excited to see a young person. They thought of me as a young person coming in and starting to farm. Jane was an avid gardener. She would, at the age of 80, and so this is the next spoiler alert, because I started farming 15 years ago and my landowner was 80. She would ride her bike down the road and come visit the gardens, you know, a couple times a month and get a tour, and was just ecstatic. So I basically started out with her with a fairly verbal lifetime lease, her lifetime. And so that's sort of how things started out here. About 5 years in, the fellow who was renting the house moved out, and I was able to move into the house, and over time was able to expand from just renting 2 acres to 4 acres to eventually renting the whole property. And so that's been sort of over 15 years. So what we do here primarily is we have about a 350 household CSA. This is primary income. There's not really much else going on by way of income other than the farm. So the CSA is really primary. There's also the 40 acres of hay, which is, you know, does what hay does. Some years it's okay and some years it's terrible. It's never really great. As income source goes, we've got about 100 layers. And there's the hay. We've got some acre and meadows and pollinator habitat that we've put in place. And then this is the bush. And we're kind of at a scale where we're a little bit stuck partway, not stuck, I actually like it here. We're somewhere between hand scale, labor focused. I've got about 5 staff. And so, you know, we do a lot of things fairly intensively by hand, but we're also fairly dependent on a tractor for primary tillage as well as for in-row cultivation, for digging our carrots. And so, you know, that we have about 4 acres that are in garden every year. So yeah, in terms of soil management, you know, I'll maybe mention a little bit about more of that in a few minutes, but certainly struggle to find ways to steward carefully at a scale that is sort of, you know, we've been experimenting with some tarping and reduced tillage, but we're certainly not going to put tarps down over a 4-acre farm, and trying to find reduced tillage methods and really responsible methods that still allow us to have the efficiency of the tractor is a ongoing challenge and concern, and an area of experimentation, which is sometimes exciting and sometimes really frustrating. So that's, I think, in terms of slides, maybe I'll just stop with those and then I'll just talk a little bit. There we go. I got the screen sharing to stop. What has changed for me in terms of land access, things that have changed over the years with living off site and moving on and having another renter here. Certainly some of the challenges we're trying to figure out how to make arrangements that worked for everybody who was sort of privy to the same piece of land. So there was farmers who rented the hay fields, and one of the reasons I chose this piece of land over some of the others that were possibilities is that it was surrounded by hayfield, and I felt like my chances of having spray drift on my garden, and also just activity level. I mean, you're not out cutting a hayfield weekly. So I felt like I would have some distance from the other operation. There'd be a little less competition, and less chance of drift. But then somebody lived in the house, and all of the well water runs through the house. So we had to make arrangements about how do I pay for my irrigation water? What about the electricity for running the fans in the greenhouse that I put up? What about his sight lines from the window, you know, looking out over this glorious landscape that he was used to looking at? And fortunately, the fellow who lived in the house was excited about the garden, but that could have gone either way. And there's no smart meters on rural properties. So, you know, figuring out, negotiating those things was tricky. fortunately, we forged a pretty good relationship, and I helped him with some things, and he helped me with some things, and brought me some scones on some days when he thought I'd worked too long, and really just tried to lean into the positive relationship, because written agreements between renters are, sort of difficult to hold each other to, because neither of us really had all that much power. But we would have interesting things come up, like I'd be running irrigation and it would suck all the water pressure, and he would want to do laundry. So he'd call me and say, could you turn off the irrigation for an hour so I can do laundry? So I would do that, but then I'd be going home. So I'd say, well, can you turn the irrigation back on in an hour when you're done? And it'll, run for the next few hours before I come back. Or so, just informal things like that. Moving to the farm certainly made some of those things a lot simpler, and then renting the entire property, there's just a lot fewer pieces in play. But I think my relationship with the landowners is different than Rav and Tom's, in that the landowners aren't farmers. They're investors. They're conservationists. They're interested in the land being used well, but they're not heavily invested personally in the landscape of this farm and the use of this farm. So, in terms of what's worked well, living off farm and renting for the first years of my business took a lot of pressure off. Rent is a lot cheaper than paying mortgage. I was able to start up without knowing how long I wanted to be here. I didn't really want a 10-year lease because I had no idea if I would want to farm in 10 years. So having a shorter term lease agreement, which we did eventually get into writing, though not the first couple of years, was actually really, really helpful for me in the early years. Moving to the farm, allowed for me to then be able to do things like have a greenhouse that I could actually manage. Before that, I'd had my seedlings offsite somewhere else. Just opening and closing a greenhouse and tending to their water needs while living offsite is fairly inefficient, and having livestock as well. So opened some doors that way. So financially, the arrangement has worked well, and I've been able to do most of what I want on this land. And I've had supportive, if somewhat absentee, landlords who have been happy for me to do what I'm doing and want me to succeed. But it's not a partnership per se. I rent the land, and they're not really involved here. Over the past 5 to 6 years, I would say that it's become more challenging as my business has grown, and my dreams about what I'd like this place to be and what I'd like to do here have grown. I've pushed up against the edges of some of the restrictiveness in, certainly in having a year-to-year lease. There's a whole lot of things that doesn't make sense to do. Everything's always got to pay for itself within 1 year. And I'm fairly conservative financially. I'm not a big risk taker. So to set myself up for a situation where I'm going to invest in things that might take 5 or 6 years to pay for themselves, I don't do it. And you look back and say, well, I've been here 15 years now. Could have made some of those choices. Probably should have planted asparagus, but you never know, because next year could always be the last year. And as my the landowner is now in her mid-90s, it does, start to really feel like every year could be the last year. And the children who inherit the land when she passes have indicated that they will sell the land at that point in time. So these are some of the super challenges. There's not a lot of security longer term now. And in terms of infrastructure investments, digging heating lines in to warm the greenhouse, does it make sense? Putting up structures all have to be done without concrete pads and in ways that they could be disassembled and taken elsewhere or sold, because nothing should be left on the land. I'd love to dig an irrigation pond instead of watering with 300-foot deep, iron-rich, mineral-heavy well water, but that's not really an option. My partner farms livestock and has to rent a separate farm where he can grow animals on pasture because we're not allowed to have pasture. We're not allowed to pasture animals other than poultry here. So, some of these restrictions meant nothing to me for the first number of years, but as my operation has grown, I've realized that this, my access here hasn't expanded with it. We also have a public trail that runs around the perimeter of the property, which my conservationist landowners put in place and opened up a couple of years ago, which is in some ways wonderful, but also has impacts for people kind of wandering across our fields, and there's not, we have really no say in that here. So these are some of the challenges that yeah, sort of get lived with and negotiated. And yeah, I think one of the other things I've really been thinking about in the past number of years is the ways that while leasing, in terms of a cash flow basis and turning net profits every year is much superior to owning. It's allowed me to have a profitable business much more quickly than a lot of startups would have been able to do. And I'm extremely grateful for that. And I haven't had the pressures of dealing with, when the well pump died, I make a phone call. It's not on me. These are really wonderful things. But it's also really hard to, I've been wanting to save to be able to purchase a property at some point down the road, or that has been the thinking until more recently, where that's maybe not remotely realistic anymore. But saving money, there's ways that profits build and money can be put away when you're able to reinvest in your business. And when you can't really reinvest because you don't own the property, not in the ways that hold value for long term, then it's either sink money into non-liquid investments, which then can't be pulled to purchase land, or you keep all your savings liquid. And when you do that, your net profit looks really good, but you get taxed pretty high and you start to lose a bunch of that potential, those potential savings. So these have been some of the struggles and some of the thought processes that have developed over the years. When I think about things that I would suggest for people entering into an agreement, or things that I would do similarly or differently, certainly having a written lease, I've felt much more secure since I've had that in writing. One of the things that has been really important for me in developing that lease was putting in a date of July, where the landowners need to give me notice by July of 1 year if they wouldn't be renewing the lease the following year. And that's not a lot of time, but it's a lot better than finding out in December. And so that, I breathe a little easier once I know we've passed that date, and I don't have to think about, I know that I'm going to be where I'm going to be for the next year. And other things to think about are just, not just who the landowners are and what the relationship will look like there, but who else uses the land? What will the impacts in the landscape be? How busy a situation do you want to be in? I think of Tom, you're saying, people are coming and going to the vineyard, or they're putting in parking lots. And, is that exciting to have people coming and going and activity happening? Or is that a nightmare scenario where you just really want to be in a quiet place? That surrounding use can have a huge impact, especially if it's a farming operation like a market garden where you're there all day, every day. Knowing how the utilities are going to be tracked, paid for, who's responsible for things if they go wrong. Yeah, and then impact of things like spray or drift, or just dust drifting across. I'm really fortunate. Our surrounding landscape is very conventionally soy, corn rotation, but we have massive tree lines around the entire property, which has been incredible, and also really helpful with the wind that would otherwise come through here. And certainly, if I were to start again, I think I would actually have tried to advocate for having a longer term lease, at least by my second year, even if I didn't know for sure that I would want to be able to farm that long, just to free up that ability to make some decisions without the 1 year limitation. So that's maybe a bit of a picture there. In terms of some of the soil here, we have a sandy loam, heavy on the sand here, and so one of the challenges over time has been working on building organic matter, and so this goes back to this, because I'm certainly not a no-till operation, and while I'm very interested in finding scale appropriate ways to integrate significantly reduced tillage here, we haven't really figured that out yet. So it's sand just burns organic matter like crazy when it's tilled. There's already so much air and oxygen burning in that soil. So that's so we worked hard at having, there's almost 12 acres in garden, and we only grow on 4 of them every year. And so putting land into rotation for a year or two in fallow at a time has been helpful in soil building, but has also allowed for the growth of more perennial weeds. And so that has been a challenge that has come along with that. And I didn't have to deal with perennial weeds at all when we were just farming the same block over and over again. Drought is certainly one of the challenges that we face here, like everyone goes through in Southern Ontario, but on sandy soil, it's we can't even get transplants to take without getting irrigation down the same day. So those have been some of the challenges, but we have managed to raise the organic matter, a little bit over the years. Here, it certainly hasn't decreased at all, and it was in perennial crops before. So I'm pleased with that as a baseline, but hoping we can figure out some ways to improve on it. It's interesting, I think, about climate change. It's hard to know quite what the impacts are, and I think I'm in a fairly buffered area. And again, I'm very fortunate. I also have a very deep well that has never failed us, except when the pump broke for 2 days. But no, that's not climate's fault. And so, do we use more water than we used to? Well, I don't know, because I don't have a surface pond that I can watch the levels go down on. I remember extremely droughty seasons in the beginning. It feels like the patterns are wackier than they were. It feels like the wind is stronger than it was, but I'm not, those challenges have existed all along. I think when I think about the impacts of climate change, it's imagining all of these things that are difficult in a season moving over time towards having more of those more often, more intensely. And what will that mean? Because we can pull through 1 month of drought in a season, but what if we just got no rain for the entire season? Well, that would be different. We can pull through a couple of days of high winds and go collect our row cover from the other sides of the fields. But what if that was every day? Or what if the winds were 5 times faster? And so, I think when I think of the impacts of climate change, what it leaves me with is a lot of motivation to continue to work harder at figuring out ways to reduce tillage. We've got good windbreaks, but making sure they're well tended, looking for places that we could introduce some more perennials into the landscape. And just, more motivation to make sure our soil is covered all the time, and we're sort of doing everything we can to leave ourselves in as good a situation as possible. I think I'll leave it at that. I've gone on enough, and there's probably lots of questions for everyone.
Wonderful. Thank you so much for sharing all of your insights and all of your experience, Angie. So now we have time for some questions and discussion. So if you'd like to ask a question, there are 3 ways to do it. You can go ahead and type that into the chat, and then I will read it to our panelists. You can raise your hand. So for most of you, if you go to the bottom of your window or the bottom of your screen, there's a little reactions option, and you can click on raise hand, which I have just done, if you're ready to ask a question, and then I'll call on you. Or if there's no one in line, you can just unmute yourself and jump in and ask a question when there is a pause. So I am going to start by asking a couple of questions from the chat. So a question for Rav, but maybe anyone who feels comfortable answering this. What is the rent you're paying for the use of land? If that's something that you're willing to answer.
Sure. So like I mentioned, the first, it was about the first half of the season, I didn't pay any rent, but I did, I guess, contribute my time and labor to the farm. So I am taking care of the chickens with some construction projects that they had going on. And then for the second half, it was $40 that was split between myself and the other farmer. So I was paying 25 and then he was doing 15 just because he had a little bit less space. For next year, I'm not sure what it's going to be because like I said, I am expanding and yeah, I think it'll be either a set rate or a percentage of what I make. I'm not really sure what that's going to look like yet.
Thanks very much. Do any of our other panelists want to speak to that, Angie?
Yeah, the land rent here is 130 an acre, which I think is pretty cheap for what, this is for me, one of the benefits of coming on board with a really supportive landowner years ago is that she wasn't really interested in kind of just continuing to push rent up and was just wanting to sort of cover land taxes. And now I'm in a situation where the children who manage the trust are doing all of the annual increases that they can, but I started so much lower than kind of going rate around me. I think the going rate around me is closer to $200 an acre for rent. And then the farmhouse is on top of that with monthly rent.
Great, thank you, Angie. Tom, would you like to answer that question?
Yeah, sure. Yeah, sure. Forgive me. My videos.
Yes, your video is off right now, and you're
Sorry
also on
about
mute. Okay, there you go. Perfect.
I'm back. The right now we don't have so to answer the question this year there's been no rent. I haven't had to pay rent and we're working towards a lease agreement, and for now because of the infrastructure and equipment share I'm doing, we're going to explore a profit share if if we start reaching a scale where we're less dependent on them in that way, then we may look at another arrangement, but that's what they proposed. And for now we're going to cross that bridge when the business starts generating more revenue that way, more net revenue. So we're looking at something around the the 7% range.
Perfect. Thank you, Tom. I see that we have someone with their hand up. Is it Atil? Did you want to ask a question? You can go ahead and unmute yourself.
Hello, yeah. Can everyone hear me?
Yes, we can.
Yeah. Oh, great. I have several questions, so I don't know how I should proceed with that.
Well, let's start with one at a time, and then we'll make sure that everyone gets a chance to ask at least one.
Okay, sounds good. I guess the first question would be in terms of land access. What is the viability of, like, I guess I mentioned in my comment, like
so you're breaking up a little bit
up
from
with other
me.
Farmers who on their own driven and that might. Okay.
Oh, you're going to type it. Okay, that's fine. I think, yes, the viability of group economics is the question. to avoid a mortgage. So you're asking about people teaming together, so forming like a collective or a co-op or something like that to share land? Okay, great. Who would like to speak to that first? With the focus of ownership, okay. Raf, that's maybe more similar to some of the things that you're doing. Did you want to start that to answer that question in terms of the economic viability?
Yeah, I'm not the best at finances and economics, honestly. So I don't know if I can answer the question maybe how you want me to, but yeah, so the farm, like I mentioned, it just kind of informally formed into a co-op without any of us realizing, which has been really nice. And with the expansion that I'm doing, I have started having conversations with the landowner and the family that lives there, because I will need to bring help on. And I'm hoping, instead of just hiring, that I can bring someone on in more of like that co-op capacity, I guess. And I think it's definitely worthwhile to look into, especially if you are a new farmer, a young farmer, because you can share those, like especially at the beginning when you're starting, there's a lot of financial input that's needed, and you can kind of share those costs. But then the other thing that you have to keep in mind is anything that you get coming in, that also has to be shared too. Yeah, sorry, I think that's all I can say on it, because I really, yeah, the economic stuff is way over my head. But if you have a more pointed question, I can try re-answering that.
Does anyone else want to speak to that question? Any of the other panelists? So I will add, especially, so there's a follow-up question. Does there already exist a group chat or side forum of individuals who are interested in teaming up in this sense? And if it doesn't exist, can we create it? And that is something that we're working on. So Sunil, who's here with us, is the NFU Ontario's land linking specialist, who is helping to make some connections. And we've definitely had some people who either already have groups or are trying to form groups in different places to jointly own and share land. So if you haven't already spoken to Sunil, I encourage you to do that. Sunil, maybe you can pop your email in there, and maybe also the link to the Farmer Questionnaire. So we have a questionnaire that we've been inviting people to fill out, whether they're a landowner or a land seeker, that has a little bit of information about kind of what you're looking for or what you already have, to help us potentially make some matches over the winter. So we'll pop that in the chat too. And if you're interested, I strongly encourage you to fill that out, and we'll try to make some connections because of that. So I'm going to move on to our next question from the chat, which is for Tom. Tom, what can you share about profitability, and is the orchard organic?
Yeah, well, a little bit about the vineyard. It's not an organic vineyard. They do practice some biodynamic principles, but they also, you know, they will spray if necessary. So, for example, late this summer there was an infestation of wasps that just completely put the whole vineyard at risk. So they sprayed for wasps. So there is some spraying. There's a buffer between our plot and the vineyard and the grapes. So that's something that is worked into our location and our spot. And in terms of our profitability this year, I mean, we're still paying ourselves back from the startup costs. So right now we're looking at a 3 to 5 year plan before we start making money at this scale and with what we're doing. So I'm not going to, I think I want to reiterate the earlier context in that, you know, the work that I do off farm is still really important to me, and it's something that I'm going to continue. And the farm is something that's, you know, complementary to that work. And for now, it's I would say it's more of a side business or a cottage business for us that way. So I mean, and part of it is we're just seeing where things are going to go in the next year or two in that regard. So, but right now our plan is to start, you know, netting some revenue back for ourselves within a 3 to 5 year horizon.
Great, thank you, Tom. I believe this is a question for Angie primarily, but anyone who wants to answer it. How do you sustain and grow crops in winter?
I don't. Yeah, we do have a greenhouse that has an unheated greenhouse that grows a few greens through the winter, but actually one of my staff manages that as a side business for herself, which is one of my employee retention strategies, is to try to give them some off-season work where they can run some sub-businesses. So she runs a winter CSA, but that's all crops that are just in storage. I personally try to get out of the fields and don't do any growing and very minimal even selling of anything other than just, you know, early season CSA shares through the winter. I find I have my hands full just with all the administrative work of the farm that kind of falls by the wayside during the main growing season. So our production is really just from April or May until November.
Great, thank you. Tom or Rav, do you want to speak to that?
I don't grow in the winter, so nothing to add.
Yeah, I mean, similarly, we're not aiming to do winter production, but trying to extend some of our late season and winter storage is something that we want to work towards. But
winter storage is from the root cellar, or winter harvest is from the root cellar.
Great, thank you. And just to add to some of the discussion in the chat about co-ops, one of our presenters next week is going to be Sally Miller from the Fair Finance Fund, who worked for a long time with local food and farm co-ops. So we're definitely going to be digging into that topic of financing and shared ownership next week at 7 p.m. So I encourage everyone to join us then. All right, next question from this is another question for Angie. How well prepared do you feel from your time at Everdale, prepared for starting out on your own?
This should be a question for Tom as well. I feel like as well prepared as one could be with 1 season of farming and 6 months of learning to start up a business and do it all yourself. Great, which means totally insufficient, but it's absolutely not Everdale's fault. Yeah, I would not recommend that as a strategy moving forward. Yeah, it worked out well for me, but my body has paid for the intensity of the labor of the first few years. Well, I pay hard for that now, and I think probably would have been wiser to get a couple seasons experience before starting a business that was supposed to be sole income. So it can be done, but I wouldn't highly recommend that. But the Everdale program was really strong in terms of practical experience, and also a day a week of more like sort of classroom style learning and visiting other farms and seeing all sorts of things was super helpful. But it's really hard to get the experience of crop planning and business management when you work for other farms, unless you stay at the same farm for multiple seasons and are able to sort of get in the back door on some of that administrative work and really have those insights behind the scenes. I think that's one of the toughest things. Learning the skills to just grow is not the hardest thing. It's all of the business management and crop planning.
Thank you. Tom, did you want to add anything to that?
I certainly can. I mean, I did the Everdale program probably a year or two after Angie was there and had a really successful season there. And I don't think it was so much about did Everdale prepare me for this. It was where it's more of your own individual, it's like your readiness, right? So as Angie said, like she felt ready after that season and went for it. And that certainly wasn't my arc. I mean, I worked for other farms and have continued to work for other farms for a few years. So I think it's more it's less of a question about Everdale and more of a question about your own readiness. And there's lots to learn at and from Everdale, and I would really recommend their program to anyone who's interested in learning, exploring. And something that that's unique about their program is that they're really well networked and integrated with so many other growers and operators that you'll really get a wide. I visited Angie's farm, for example, when I was an intern at Everdale. So yeah, you'll get a seat at the buffet if you're there.
Wonderful. Thanks. Rav, did you want to add anything about your training experiences?
Sure. I also actually did the craft program also, but I was at Ignatius a few years ago. Yeah, really great program. I had never ever farmed before, never even like, I think touched dirt before that. So it was a really great learning experience for me. Obviously you're not going to learn everything like in 6 months or 4 months that you're at a farm. And for me specifically, it was a little challenging starting my own farm this year because a lot of the crops that I focus on growing, like bitter melon, okra, a lot of farmers just don't grow them. So I never really got mentorship or opportunities to learn from others of how to grow them, sell them, and market them to communities. So yeah, lots of just self-learning also. But yeah, really great program, and I would recommend it to others if they're interested.
Perfect. Thank you. Next question for any panelist who can answer. What kind of insurance does everyone have around insurance and liability? What is the agreement between landowners and you regarding insurance for both yourself, the landowner, crop damage, visitor liability, etc.? Who would like to start with that? Tom, you spoke a little bit before about working on the agreement. Can you speak to the insurance issue specifically?
Yeah, so the landowners required that I carried small business insurance, which I intended to, have anyway. So that's what I have in place. I have a small business insurance, which is tailored towards a small farm business. So that's the coverage that I'm bringing to the table. There was some talk with the vineyard owners that I could conceivably get on their payroll as well if that was helpful, but I haven't needed to because the insurance that I have for the small business covers me for everything that at least I'm at risk of. So
thanks.
Same here. The landowners require having business insurance. So I've had that since the beginning. That covers liability in terms of people that are my customers who come to the farm, or basically anyone who comes to the farm and is potentially injured on the portion of it that I am responsible for, which doesn't really include the bush, and that's good because that's where the public access is, and that's their responsibility. Any equipment, if I don't insure it and it is destroyed, that's my problem. So I have all of my equipment and buildings insured. And then I need to write the landowners trust that owns this land off as an additional insured in my insurance agreement. And so, essentially, if something terrible were to happen here, the insurance companies would fight it out over who's responsible for what portion of it, and it would be allocated to our premiums accordingly. Is probably the simplest and most vague at the same time way of putting all of that.
Thank you. Rav?
Yeah, not much more to add. Very similar situations. I just have like very basic general liability insurance. The property, the family, they are pretty private, so I can't have like the public or people coming on to the farm to help me or anything. So and I also don't have like equipment that would need insurance. So it's very basic, and they asked me if I had it before I started, but they didn't ask to see any copies, and I don't have to list them as an additionally insured in the policy.
Thanks.
Jumping in
Oh,
for a second, sorry. I see that someone followed up with a question about personal injury insurance. And yeah, I certainly don't have that. Though employees would have WSIB coverage. So yeah, that's a tricky one as a sole proprietor, though. NFU does have, anyways, you guys can talk about your program that's been rolling out. Yeah, personal injury is always a bit of a tricky one. Everyone else is covered.
Thank you. A related question, who takes care of security at the farm in case you have expensive tools, for example? Angie, I think you have the most infrastructure in place, probably. Do you want to start with that one?
My dog barks. Honestly, that's it. Yeah, there's not really, I mean, you can lock doors, but yeah, we don't have any real security other than our own ears and eyes and our dog.
Makes sense. Tom or Rav, anything to add there?
No, I mean, I live off farm, so it's a good question, but you know, the vineyard where I am, it actually has, I mean, they have hundreds of thousands of dollars of wine product, and consequently, it's never anything I look for, but they have security cameras for the winery itself, and then there are neighbors who are immediately adjacent to where I have my plot, who I've gotten to know, and so just knowing that there's a few people living who I have a good relationship with right nearby is definitely helpful. And even though I'm on farm, it's on the edge. It's right on the edge of a village, so I have some, you know, I don't feel like it's in a remote location that someone could really get to without being noticed easily by other neighbors and people in the area.
Great, thank you. Another question. I know there are several options for an agroecological focus, but is there any school, institute, any learning opportunity that teaches according to the principles of natural farming by Masanobu Fukuoka? I don't know of anything in Canada. Do any of our panelists or other participants know? If you do, please mention it in the chat. Worldwide is fine too. So I think those are all of the questions from the text queue. Does anyone have any more questions before we start to wrap things up this evening? So either put it in the chat or raise your hand or just unmute yourself and ask. Okay, well, I want to quickly read a couple of the things that people had said in some comments from the chat. Thank you to all of our panelists for sharing such wonderful sharing of experience and insight. Very grateful. Rav, Tom, and Angie, your courage and commitment and success are so inspiring. Thank you. All the presenters are doing an amazing job taking out time for this social interaction to encourage new farmers. Kudos to all of you, also the host, for organizing the event. And thank you so much. This has been very informative. Yeah, it's been a real pleasure to have all of you joining us here this evening. And thank you for everyone who came as a participant. Angie, Rav, Tom, is there anything that you'd like to add before we wrap up?
If any of you are in the Ottawa area, let us know, and we'd love to see you. Come by.
Angie?
I hope that everyone can find the perfect match.
Rav?
Thanks for spending so much time with us tonight, and especially if you're just entering into farming. There's lots of like non-traditional ways that you can get onto land, and I highly encourage you to explore them because there's lots of benefits to them.
Wonderful. Well, thank you so much. I think that's just about well, thank you very much. I think it's time for us to wrap up. Please do fill out the questionnaire that Sunil linked to in the chat here if you want a little bit of help finding maybe a match, whether you're a landholder or a land seeker, or if you just want to share a little bit about what you're looking for and what your experience is, which will affect the kind of policy advocacy work that we do in our organizations in the future. So thank you so much to my colleagues. Thanks especially to Sunil for putting together our group of panelists this evening. Thank you to Catherine and Herschel at the Ontario Farmland Trust. Thank you to Ashley Redmond for helping to promote it. And thank you everyone here for joining. I hope that you all have a wonderful evening, and I hope that we'll see a bunch of you again next Thursday at the same time, 7 p.m. for discussion of farm financing with Sally Miller and Isabel Rodet. So thank you so much, and have a great night.